The Perimeter, a true story of extreme isolation. The following account is compiled from the journal entries and incident report filed by the subject, Elias Vance, following his short-term lease of a remote, decommissioned fire lookout facility in the Cariboo region of British Columbia in the late autumn of 2017. Names have been changed to protect identities. The silence and the solitude. My reason for moving to Lookout 14, a decommissioned Forest Service tower perched atop Mount Cariboo, was simple: I needed silence. As a struggling novelist, I chased solitude the way a prospector chases gold, and this place promised a motherlode of both. The nearest sign of civilization was the small, seasonal logging outpost of Three Forks, 53 miles down the single, unmaintained service road. The tower itself was a classic aluminum-sided box, roughly 14 feet square, mounted on a 50-foot steel trestle. It offered a brutal, 360-degree panorama of rolling pine forests and peaks dusted with early snow. It was paradise. I signed the lease in early October, agreeing to stay until the first major snowfall made the service road impassable, around 8 weeks. My supplies were ferried up in a single, grueling trip by a local retired ranger, Frank, who gave me the keys and one stern piece of advice: when the generator dies, Elias, you are truly alone. Don't push it. For the first 2 weeks, it was everything I dreamed of. I fell into a monastic routine, writing from sunup to noon, a long, silent hike in the afternoon, and evenings spent reading by the glow of the kerosene lamp. The isolation was profound, broken only by the crackle of my VHF radio, which only ever picked up fragmented weather reports and the occasional, heavily static-laced logging crew chatter, too garbled to ever make out words, just noise. The anxiety started subtly, like a low-frequency hum. It began with the door. The lookout cab had a heavy, industrial-grade steel door that opened inward, secured by a solid deadbolt. Every night, before turning in, I would run the deadbolt and place an old wooden wedge under the door for added measure. I was careful, almost ritualistic, about it. On the morning of October 18th, I went to open the door, and the wooden wedge, which I knew I'd driven tightly under the jamb, was lying 3 feet away on the floor, on the other side of the room. The deadbolt was still engaged. I dismissed it instantly. Would contracts in the cold. I must have kicked it off in my sleep. End of discussion. But 2 days later, the same thing happened. This time, I'd marked the position of the wedge with a strip of masking tape. It was gone, lying 10 feet away under my desk. My heart hammered, but my rational mind, trained by years of urban skepticism, fought back hard. It's the vibration of the wind. The tower was constantly swaying slightly in the powerful high-altitude gusts. I replaced the wedge with a heavy cinderblock I found in the storage area downstairs. It weighed 30 pounds. The next morning, the cinderblock was still in place. I felt a wave of relief so intense it was almost dizzying. I laughed at my paranoia. This was what solitude did to a city brain. Then I realized I hadn't moved the block. But the rug beneath it, a worn piece of Berber carpet, was bunched up an inch away from the block, as if the block had shifted just slightly. It hadn't been kicked. It had been pushed. To the second floor. The lookout tower was built in 2 sections, the large, single-room cab at the top, and a lower, smaller, enclosed platform halfway up the trestle, designed for equipment storage and a small landing. I rarely used the lower platform. It was during my 4th week that I started taking inventory of my supplies, driven by a nagging sense of mismanagement. I went down to the lower platform to check the supply crates. The area was a mess of rusty tools, ancient rain gear, and boxes of long-expired rations. It also housed the tower's primary water storage, 2 massive, 50-gallon blue plastic drums that caught rainwater from the roof. I had checked them on arrival, and they were nearly full. Now, one of the drums was tipped over on its side. It was bone dry. I stood there, staring at the empty, silent plastic behemoth. Tipping over one of these full drums would require serious effort, maybe 2 men. But this one was empty. The top hatch was screwed shut. How could an empty, sealed drum tip itself over? The wind could rattle the tower, but it couldn't generate that kind of focused force on a single, squat object. I checked the second drum. It was still standing, still full. I reached for the valve to check the level, and that's when I saw it. Tucked into the dusty space where the drain valve met the drum, there was a small, tightly folded piece of paper. I pulled it out, my hands trembling. It was a single, 3x5 slip of paper. The handwriting was neat, printed in blue ink. It read, "The water is fine, but you're wasting energy." I dropped the paper as if it were burning. The silence of the mountain, the beautiful, calming silence, suddenly became a wall, pressing in. I scrambled back up to the main cab, slammed the door, engaged the deadbolt, and pushed the cinderblock back against the jamb. I didn't care about the rug this time. I looked out the windows, scanning the tree line, the service road, the clear, pale sky. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. The radio was useless. No cell service, of course. I was 53 miles from the nearest human being I knew of. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the corner with my hunting knife, listening to the wind howl and the steel trestle groan. 3. The shadow routine. The note confirmed my terror. Someone was out there. Not only that, they were inside my perimeter, close enough to know that I had been wasteful with the non-existent electricity, close enough to leave a note. They had accessed the lower deck, probably in the brief window when I was on one of my long afternoon hikes. I became obsessed. I stopped writing. My routine now consisted only of surveillance and fortification. I started marking the ground. I scattered a thin layer of sugar around the base of the trestle legs. I sprinkled flour on the lower platform floor. I carefully placed small, insignificant pebbles on the service road at the precise spot where the forest ended, creating an invisible, breakable tripwire. Every morning, the sugar and flour were undisturbed. The pebbles were always where I left them. The cinderblock stayed put. My stalker, if that's what he was, had stopped leaving proof. He was smarter than that now. But the subtle changes continued. My kerosene supply, which I used for the lamp, was draining too fast. I measured it, nearly twice the rate of consumption from the first 2 weeks. A specific heavy-duty tarp I used to cover the generator downstairs was folded differently one evening. I had rolled it haphazardly. Now it was folded into neat thirds. One night, I heard a sound that was too distinct to be the wind. It was the low click of a metal latch being secured, coming from the direction of the outhouse, about 40 yards away. I waited, knife in hand, for an hour. Nothing. I realized he wasn't trying to scare me away, he was demonstrating control. He was proving that the tower wasn't a sanctuary, it was a display case. The realization brought a paralyzing wave of clarity. He wasn't attacking me because he didn't need to. He had all the time in the world. He was living off the supplies I didn't know I had, maybe even using the tower's facilities when I was asleep or out. But how was he getting in, and where was he hiding? The area was barren rock and sparse trees for hundreds of yards. The only way up to the cab was the ladder, and I would have heard anyone climbing it. Then I remembered Frank's advice, when the generator dies, Elias, you are truly alone. I went down to the small, separate aluminum shed where the diesel generator was housed, about 20 feet from the base of the tower. I used it sparingly, only for recharging my laptop and headlamp batteries. I had about 10 gallons of diesel left, enough for several more weeks. I opened the shed. The generator was running perfectly, humming quietly. I hadn't turned it on. I checked the fuel gauge. It was nearly empty. Someone had run the generator until it was almost out of gas. Wasting it. Not because they needed the power, but because they needed to guarantee my isolation. By draining the fuel, they were ensuring that the window for me to communicate or seek help via a recharge device was rapidly closing. I grabbed the last 5-gallon can of diesel, secured the shed with my own heavy chain and padlock, and headed back to the tower, heart pounding a rhythm of pure dread. The sun was setting, and the temperature was dropping fast. 4. The Keeper's Watch. The game was over. I had to leave. But leaving meant walking 53 miles in sub-freezing temperatures, exposed, knowing the stalker was already prepared and well supplied. I had to wait until morning. I spent the last full night fortifying the cab. I moved the heavy writing desk, the iron frame cot, and a collection of old lead-acid batteries against the door. I knew it wouldn't stop a determined person, but the noise would buy me time. Around 2 a.m., I was staring out at the inky blackness when I noticed a faint, recurring pattern of light in the distance. It wasn't a headlight, it was a small, sharp flash, like a lens catching the moon. It was coming from the direction of the old, long-abandoned timber cabin, 3 miles north of the tower, a landmark Frank had pointed out on the map. He was watching me from there. 3 miles away. The realization brought a sickening relief. He wasn't in the tower. I was wrong. At 4:30 a.m., just as the sky was beginning to turn the color of bruised slate, a noise brought me bolt upright. It wasn't a push against the door. It was a rhythmic, almost metallic squeak creak, coming from below the floor of the cab. The floor of the lookout cab was old particle board over aluminum framing. The sound was directly under my feet, near the center of the room. Squeak creak. Squeak creak. Like someone shifting their weight on a loose floorboard. I froze, knife raised, listening. It stopped. I carefully lifted the rug near where the sound came from. The floorboards looked solid, sealed, painted. There was nothing. I got down on my knees, pressed my ear to the floor, and tapped lightly. Nothing but the hollow sound of wood and aluminum. My fear, however, demanded action. I grabbed a hammer and chisel and started prying at the seam of a floorboard right where I heard the sound. It was difficult, but after 10 minutes, I managed to lift the board. Underneath was a tightly sealed wooden box, fitted perfectly into the aluminum frame. It looked like an old, built-in storage compartment. I wrenched the lid open. Inside, there was a small, high-powered digital camera, mounted to face directly upwards through a perfectly drilled, tiny hole in the underside of the floorboard, aimed at the center of the room, right where I kept my desk. The hole was invisible unless you were directly underneath it. Next to the camera was a leather-bound journal. I pulled it out. It was a handwritten log, meticulously organized. The entries weren't about surveillance, they were about me. October 3rd, tenant arrived. Set up camp. Unpacked books. He seems quiet. Writer type. Unimaginative. The cinderblock is unnecessary. We'll move it anyway, just to see. October 10th, water stores checked. He is wasting the runoff, thinks the drums are for emergency only. I will need to empty one for the auxiliary tank. I miss the sound of the rain on the cab. I miss the view. October 22nd, he panicked about the note. The irony. He never even noticed the ladder on the inside wall of the lower platform. It leads directly to the subfloor crawlspace. He never saw the cam in the vent. November 1st, he's getting jumpy. I need to slow the kerosene usage. Tonight, I will prime the generator and run it low. He needs to realize his true situation before the snow comes. He has a knife. Stupid. I flipped back a page, my vision blurring. The date at the top of the entry sent a shock of icy terror through me. September 24th, Frank says the new tenant, Elias, will arrive next week. I've known Frank's schedule for 20 years. The lease is set for 8 weeks, but the first heavy snow is predicted early this year. I estimate I have 6 weeks before he tries to leave. Plenty of time. I've cleared out the lower platform, only leaving the drums for show. The view from up here is still the best in the Cariboo. The name signed at the bottom of the log, under the final, unsettling observation, was printed neatly in blue ink, F.R. Frank, the retired ranger who leased me the tower, had never left. He hadn't been watching me from 3 miles away. He had been living, hidden, directly beneath my feet. He was the true keeper of Lookout 14, and I was merely a temporary, monitored curiosity in his perfect wilderness cage. The aftermath. I didn't wait for the sun. I pulled on my warmest layers, grabbed my small emergency pack and my hunting knife, and left the journal and the camera exactly where I found them. I closed the floorboard, put the rug over it, and quietly, carefully, removed the barricade from the door. I descended the long ladder in the pre-dawn darkness, shaking so violently I nearly fell. I bolted the generator shed and started the 53-mile walk immediately. I didn't look back once. I walked hard for 17 hours straight until I hit the edge of Three Forks, where a bewildered logging crew found me. I filed the report, but nothing came of it. No charges were laid. When the provincial police finally got a truck up to the tower a week later, they found the cab deserted. The logbook and camera were gone, and the floorboard was perfectly sealed. The generator was dead, out of fuel. Frank's old timber cabin was empty, of course. The only physical evidence remaining was the heavy cinderblock, still leaning against the door jamb, and the single blue drum of water, still standing. The empty drum was nowhere to be found. I have not been able to sleep in a second-story room since. I live on the ground floor now, and I've replaced every single floorboard in my house with poured concrete. I know that the danger wasn't the wilderness, the elevation, or the cold. The danger was the men who felt he owned the quiet, and who viewed my life as a temporary intrusion on his solitude, an intrusion he could easily, and quietly, monitor and control from a dark space no one would ever think to check. To this day, I can still hear that sound, especially on a cold night, the soft, rhythmic squeak creak of a floorboard, right beneath my feet. And I always wonder what Frank is writing about now.